My first acquaintance with drawing from life was probably at the Art Students League. And I sat there in a class under Robert Beverly Hale, uh, and the class itself was an anatomy class. He would come in and lecture on anatomy. He did the most marvelous things with the with, what was it, a 4 foot long stick with a charcoal attached to the end, and he drew on a white chalkboard. And he articulated the muscles, the bones. It's quite a compelling thing, just engaging as heck to watch. And and uh, and we we watched him do this, and watched him do that. We had bones in the room. I sat there and copied bones. I drew from skulls. I drew the pelvis. I drew the femur. I have all these drawings of all these bones. Obviously, I couldn't draw the muscles per se on these guys. Hadn't had the experience with Michelangelo and was it even people like Jericho later on, uh, Davinci cutting up cadavers and that nasty stuff. But nevertheless, I sat in the classroom, and as I worked in that classroom, first of all, the classroom was all dedicated to construction drawing. So you just hack a line, hack a line, hack a line, hack a line, drawing a beautiful figure, hack a line. And it never made beautiful sense to me at all. And these 10-minute poses, of course, all you could do is hack lines. You'd never get to anything that would look like a beautiful line, like the figure, like the contour of a figure. But that's beside the point. But in the course of uh, drawing in that classroom, and even the reason I'd been there was that I knew nothing about drawing, and it became clearer and clearer I knew nothing about drawing. So here I was drawing bones, knowing nothing about drawing. And this is really kind of the quandary before Antiguos and other people who talk like this. And by the way, thank you, Antiguos. I don't mind the strength. I like the strength of your expressed opinions. I think it's really good. You sound young, but it's a really good thing to strongly express yourself, because there's nothing more great to have said something strongly and be wrong, and to be wrong, to be noticeably wrong. I tell students when they're painting to make a mark that's strong, so you can easily see how you're wrong. And so I like that. So you know what we're talking about. Antiguos says if you don't study anatomy, you'll be always getting it wrong, regardless of your surface treatment. And even though I don't precisely know what you'll always be getting wrong, if you don't study anatomy, will you always be getting the anatomy wrong? No matter how well you articulate exactly what's happening on the surface, or what exactly does he mean? So if he means you'll get the look of nature wrong, well, that's another story, because that's the impressionist conversation, right? And what I mean to do is walk you this time through a conversation about, is it regardless of your surface treatment? Well, the surface contains the content with which you make the appearance of a muscle, right? So if your surface treatment, I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by treatment, but if your surface marks don't look like nature, then they couldn't possibly represent those muscles either. On the other hand, if they sort of in some way represent muscles that may or may not appear under the skin, and they don't show on the surface, then any surface marks that indicate those muscles would be false, wouldn't they? Visually false, given the lighting and all those sorts of things. So this is if you don't study anatomy, you'll always get it wrong regardless of your surface treatment. And that's a phenomenally interesting question in one sense, but it's the classic question that many, many students ask. But I'm going to offer you something else, because what anatomy is a science, right? It's a study of muscles, bones, and all those sorts of things that apply strictly to the human figure, right? Or to other animal life. And so you'd study that science, and there's no end to the study of that science, by the way. So you may as well just dig in and be there for about 10 years. It's a major science unto itself. You have to sort out other things about how much of what exactly about anatomy you're studying that was useful to you as a painter, because that's really important. I probably read 5 different books on anatomy when I was a student, with the same idea in mind about I want to be good, and just people would say things, so you just do with it, that sort of thing. I did drawings from, as I said, from bones and all the rest, from the filleted figure by Houdon, the Houdon man. And so I did all those things that one tends to do, trying to keep up or to catch up or to get ahead, maybe ahead of the competition, but at least to move along in your skills. Uh, and to sum it up, though, I would simply say that until I learned to see, I couldn't even draw that. I couldn't even draw muscles and bones well. So I was sort of learning stuff, but I wasn't able to render it any more accurately than if I'd known all the muscles in their place, or if I'd known them particularly well. Uh, but when I mention the science, though, the idea of the science, I'm going to suggest to you that there's a whole bunch of sciences that we deal with here in our world. And I want to just show you this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's in the middle of a poem about a squirrel, a squirrel and a mountain having a conversation and a little back and forth. But he says, but all sorts of things in weather must be taken in together to make up a year and a sphere. and it's very clear that all these things have application, right? So I'm not that guy who says mustn't study anatomy. I'm saying no matter what you study, watch out that you don't start bypassing your eyeballs, okay? And that you bypass the science of the eyeballs, which is the most crucial thing, okay? So what I hope to do in this thing is talk a bit about these various sciences and then point you toward the one science that I think overrides all of them. And maybe next week, if we run out of time this week, we'll just do two of these. The next week, I'll just dedicate to talking about that last portion about what I'm really talking about, okay? Which is all you hear me talking about in all these videos anyway, by the way. Some people like to call this impressionism. Gamble call it impressionism, but it's painting from life. It's painting from life, right? Painting out of your head is a different game entirely. So don't take anything I'm talking about today to have anything to do with anything, making up figures in your head and all that stuff. I commend people who study anatomy when they're trying to make up figures out of their head or finding other strategies that are non-visual. It's all good stuff. Memorizing proportions and things like that. But let's just see if we can move through this. I think I didn't finish my point, but I'm a little distracted. So here are drawings by Davinci. We'll base all this stuff sort of on Davinci. Davinci is like the scientist. He's the first really truly analytical guy in our field, at least the one with the most sort of, shall we say, science skills. And so here he is cutting up the figure. He must have pulled the skin off of this guy, and now he's this cadaver, and now he's very carefully drawing all this stuff. Each of the muscles and muscle groups and all that sort of thing, and it's quite remarkable stuff. Who would not want to know this stuff in a sense? I can't tell you I'd be that guy who'd want to go and dig up the cadaver. I ran from biology class, so I'm definitely not that guy. I managed to avoid all the dissection in a biology class. Isn't that funny? I do like that conversation, by the way, about Ang. They said that at one point somebody brought bones, a skeleton, into the Yang studio, and he apparently saw it out of the corner of his eye. There's two different stories about him, but this is the more dramatic one. He saw it out of the corner of his eye and they said he sort of backed away, like horrified, backed away. And then he managed to disappear and wouldn't come back until they got rid of the skeleton. So there's some fun stories. If you don't have those Ang anecdotes, do ask me for them. Send me an email and I'll send them to you. They're really nice, 30 or more pages of really good stuff. Two different sources from the French, and we've Gamow and myself have translated the French for you. But anyway, so you're looking at these things that are analyzed, and you can see that when he's handling the shoulder here, the Davinci is turning the shoulder this way, and then he turns it again, and he's showing you all these different things. So your memory of this stuff, you could argue, is just the names of things, but in fact it isn't. You've got to know where their insertions are, you've got to know what happens, and supposedly this is the kind of information that's really useful when you're drawing the figure. You know, what happens when you turn a little bit more, and all of a sudden this muscle shows up, and that muscle shows up, and all that sort of thing. Now, never mind the fact that most people don't have muscles that show up at all. Never mind like this. But that's the science of anatomy. It's literally the breaking down of all breaking down, the unpacking of all the musculature, the bone structure, and all the rest of that stuff, even to the point of actually analyzing the exact proportions of bones in relation to each other and that sort of thing. Richet does that sort of thing. And Richet is one of the good books to read. I say read. I mean, some of these books are hard to read, but you should read at least one and really review the others closely. I almost thought of the other one. There's a nice book. It was written originally in French. I think it's maybe called Anatomy for Artists, but it's an older book, and it was much more readable than most, including Richet. So, one of the interesting things is here's Michelangelo, and he's put a bunch of time into breaking down the figure, cutting up the figure, and all that sort of stuff. He still winds up with in that these figures, especially that one in the upper right. That's where that famous sack of walnuts comment comes from with Davinci talking about Michelangelo mocking him. But you see the rib cage of that figure up there. But this guy really does do a remarkable male figure. I mean, like it's the ideal male figure, and he's memorized it like heck. He's really got it down. But the female suffers. I mean, so he's put all this time into memorizing the male figure, and then it's almost like he thinks he can apply it to the female. Now, it's not an extreme case, but this doesn't feel anywhere near as female as this feels male, shall we say. So now he's got this other job, right? And that is, can you go memorize the human female and all the proportions and all those other things that relate to that? And so there's this book. Richet actually wrote another book. I don't know that it's ever been translated in English. I have this copy of the La Femme, but you have that issue to deal with. Then you have the fact that every single age of a man, and that's what you're seeing in the bottom lower portion here, the right lower portion, you have the size of a head, like the kid's head at this age his head is 1/4 of his body type. This guy actually drags you over and insists the male, when he's full size, his head is an eighth. It's an eighth of a figure. I measured the figures every time I drew for the model for 3 straight years, and I rarely found once. I think I saw, and I measured them purposely to understand this, to see what the average was. And I very rarely saw an 8-headed figure. That's really more like the Greek god model. It's the ideal figure and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, but these kinds of variations all happen to you as well. So make sure you memorize all these things and keep on doing this stuff. Memorize, memorize, memorize. And by the way, memorize everything that every muscle can do in a different light from what it's in now, right? I mean, like the myriad of possibilities visually is endless, right? And I don't say this to make fun of anybody. I'm telling you, this is a deep science that has no end of ramifications if you're going to put your mind to it. And then there's the animal anatomy, right? You're going to draw animals? So here's this whole room full of women drawing a horse, apparently, is sitting over there in the front. Well, not just women, it's everybody, men and women. And so here are these horse drawings. And my question for you was, are they drawing these things from anatomy, or are they drawing them from sight? And you would say, Antiguos, that they probably it'd be nice if they had some knowledge of anatomy so they can draw them more accurately. And if you said that, by the way, that would have been a more plausible way to say it, but to say that you couldn't possibly do it right without knowledge of anatomy, that's a tougher sell and a hard one to defend. But here are all these people sitting here. I guess who knows? Do they have bones have they already pre-memorized all the muscles and all the rest of the stuff of a horse? Anyway, but there's the study of anatomy of the animal, right? And then there's the next science that you have to do if you're going to be a landscape painter. Don't you have to study the artistic anatomy of trees? And there's the Rex Vicat Cole book, right? And here's the anatomy of trees. To draw a good tree, you have to know the anatomy of trees, right? Otherwise, you won't get it right. Now, I don't mean to be doing this to be facetious. I'm telling you, this is really a crucial thing to have thought through. So if you get that, if you believe that you can't draw accurately without knowing things about things, then that would also mean you can't draw trees accurately. And even worse and better than that, rather, and you can't draw leaves accurately. By the way, it was funny that in talking about, oops, look at that, I have botany with an H. So get it, but if you're doing trees and counting the leaves, and I guess they need to be pretty accurate. When you're painting from sight and you're drawing what the leaves do visually, this thing goes away, and it isn't a problem. I was going to say Leighton was given credit at one point by a botanist for having drawn this olive tree or something like perfectly. The leaves were, each leaf was like perfect. Well, yeah, you can do that. I mean, there's nothing saying you can't study a tree in that way. I mean, like do linear drawings of every leaf on a tree. There's nothing. There's study is study, and there's nothing. And by the way, with all that I'm saying, I'm not saying don't study anatomy and don't study everything. But what I want to get my head around for people is to understand that head knowledge is not the solution, right? And the solution to what, right? So here's the anatomy of the landscape. So doesn't the landscape painter, on the same assumption, doesn't he have to know what's underlying a mountain to actually draw it accurately, to draw what he sees? And so here's here rock identification. Here's a topographical map, and then here's a cutaway of the side of a hill, and all these erosion things and all this sort of stuff, And so, how much of this underlying anatomy do we need? And I really am not being facetious. I'm asking that question with all. I want you to think this through. I want us to think this through. Tell me if I'm crazy. Then there's the anatomy of drapery, right? There are books written on the anatomy of drapery, and Davinci was a marvel of a student of sight. By the way, and Gamble, I believe he gives credit to Velázquez for being the first impressionist. I actually think Da Vinci was at one point, but this study from life, it really sets the tone for the future, for people to really draw what they see, articulate well the light, the form, the shapes, the great relationships of things visual. I suppose you could argue he might be the first realist, but actually because he's using light in a way that's profoundly like what eventually comes about for all of us. I'd say more than that. But look at this beautiful stuff, and then jump down to here's a couple Degas doing these studies for one of his early pictures. And we've all done these because we admired the Da Vinci so much. He's had such a wonderful example. So we've done these studies. Ang is doing a more superficial one. There's a couple he's done that are pretty worked up, but most of them aren't. And this is that discussion, by the way, about lay figures that you mentioned, Antiguos, in the rest of your statement. This very well might have been set up from a lay figure. He said not to use them, but then his students said they would find that he had set up a thing like this on the corner of his the stair railing or something like that, and to be using it to draw from as if it were a figure. And then here's the Leighton, and again these are Leighton's a marvel of drapery drawing, but that's the lasting influence. But drapery can be said in itself to be a science, the points where the fall starts, the way the turns of the folds go. The various kinds of folds, it's like studying the clouds. Oh, that's a science I didn't even think of, cloud science. You got to think about whether I'm crazy by saying that are these sciences not sort of equally important depending on what you're trying to do with your painting, right? So here's everybody knows perspective, right? I remember seeing one just like this bottom left one when I was a student in grade school. And it very impressed me. I played with it. I think most guys I knew did. I don't know that it caught the attention of girls as much. I had discussions with a bunch of young girls when I was a kid, and they just didn't see it, and they didn't feel like playing with it, but we all did. As soon as we saw that we could make a three-dimensional box by making one box and then making another box behind it and connecting the lines, we suddenly had no end of fun getting the 3D thing, right? And there again, this is Da Vinci using the science, the recently developed science, before Uccello, right, had worked that significantly up. And Da Vinci brought something scientific to every single thing he ever did. He really was an analyst. I would say as much as anything at all, he was an analyst, and he was an analyst of the art and of the art of seeing, and so much of, like I say, is the analyst of the art. So much of what he did was, ultimately destructive because he would do experiments on a project that he was working on, like the Last Supper, and which rendered it impossible to keep up over time. Anyway, so the whole science of perspective, and so are you going to go? How deep are you going to? Do you have to know perspective? Now, this is a big question. I mean, that's a question, how deep, but the question is, And this is where a lot of things come about, and I talk about anatomy as well. The discussion happened with Gamel. This was related to me, and I remembered after a little bit after Tom Donnelly mentioned it to me. He said, Gamel said something specific about these two things. He said, anatomy and perspective, you need to learn them, you need to study them, and then forget you ever heard about them. And that's really, really kind of an interesting thing, but that's very true of the underlying non-visual science. And there's a bunch of them associated with what we do, and I'll show you the rest of, or a whole bunch more of them, and I'm not even trying to be exhaustive. But yes, it's true that if you happen to be drawing a building and all of a sudden it just looks funny, and you have knowledge of perspective, you can say, oh yeah, yeah, these things are supposed to be going down on this plane and not, because of the vanishing point or whatever. That's really good, useful information. The problem is when you start drawing from it, like when you draw figures from anatomy. When you have a figure sitting in front of you, and you're drawing it from anatomy, doesn't mean you can't mess around with the figure sitting in front of you and draw bones and muscles and stuff into them. We all did stuff like that and analyze the figure hunting for the muscles. I found it, frankly, pretty boring. I was so far from the point. But nevertheless, it's similar, though, when you put up you have a building sitting in front of you and you draw a theoretical building. You draw a bunch of lines and stuff and construct perspectivistically a thing and then try to build the likeness on top of it. I'll show you a Sargent later on where you can see that couldn't possibly be what he was doing, especially with a watercolor and the speed you have to move, given the setting. So let's talk about this. Now, what I'm doing here, one of my favorite paintings in the Clark Museum was this Boilly. And Boilly, this is a beautiful little, almost Trompe type painting, but this little section of it, the glass. So do you have to study the science of painting glass? Huh. Do you have to study the science of painting casts? Do you have to know the way brass works and study brass? Or do you actually have to know another science that gives you all these things? And I say this to tempt you a little bit because you're not going to do all these things. And the question is, what's underlying the study of glass? How is it less important than studying what's underlying of the skin of a human? It's just a thought. But then Davinci does move us all toward light, as everybody knows, and which quickly moves us all toward this analysis, right, that you see everywhere, right? This is one of the first things that Gamel laid out was that the content of light. There's the shadow line. Everything on this side of it's light. All the form is in the lights. From the other side of the shadow line, that's the line beyond which no direct light gets. This is called the atmosphere. This is the atmospheric shadow, and there's a number of things you learn about that. And then there's the cast shadow, and there's the penumbra, which is this. Sometimes you have a secondary shadow. We think of the secondary shadow flopping around. So if your light isn't narrow, you'll have this feeling of lights coming from two different sides on the thing and casting soft edges, and so on, right? And reflected lights, and everybody knows all this stuff, right? That's the science of light, and that's a good one to know too. But it's also not the key one. Would you believe? But we're getting closer because now we're starting to use our eyes and observe the world. But this is the world of the realist. This probably is the way Impressionism differs most strongly from the new realism of today. Because the new realism is the analysis of stuff on an object, things that happen to objects. And it's a science in itself, and it's one you should know and you should have played with, right? I won't say any more about it than that for now. Because you also have the color of daylight to deal with, right? This is the entire world. Are you going to study the science of, Monet apparently had some experiences out there with not just the color of daylight, but what happened when in the printing world, in magazines with the spotting. Yeah, you hear Seurat, I guess, more closely associated with that, but with the little dots. You see the little dots down here, and what happens where these dots meet and what effects they produce. Yeah, there was a lot of that science that was having an effect on people, but does that mean you couldn't hit color notes if you didn't know that science? Well, and then there's this one, which is the Munzel. Well, this is far more important, by the way, and I would suggest to you this is one that's very useful, but about as useful, in fact, probably more useful than anatomy. And that's the pigment mixing issue, the Munzel wheel, et cetera, et cetera. Because that's based on what you really do. That's actually how real colors that you can get out of tubes really do mix, and how close you can get to the actual spectrum and what kinds of things happen. So the science, rather, in a certain way, of the of color. And I like what Graydon Parrish has been doing with that, laying it on people. Other people do as well, and there's a lot on the Munzo wheels. It's a really useful thing to know and forget. But the fact is, to know it is very helpful. The idea of triads, the idea of red, yellow, and blue. Uh, Frankly, we live on red, yellow, and blue in this world that we live in. Every color has to have been adjusted through that range. So that's been a great contribution, no question about it. So, are you going to die without knowing it? You might more quickly die without knowing that than you would without knowing anatomy. Is my perspective, right? But now I'm going to end this with this conversation here. What about the science of the visual impression? What Max Meldrum calls the ocular science. What about that? Do you think we have to study that? Now, if you're a guy like DeCamp, and I don't show any of his pictures here, or if you're a guy like Sargent or Zorn, who I do, you know, you know this is the science. This is the thing. And so what did DeCamp say? He says it's just he reduces all the painting. It's just the right color and the right value in the right place. Now that's intriguing stuff. That's really intriguing stuff, isn't it? So you're trying. So here I am in this figure. You've seen this before. Sorry, I'm wearing it out, but it was such a marvelous thing for me to have experienced. I'd done cast drawing, obviously, before I did this. And this isn't a highly developed one. I don't know how many days I spent. I might have spent 4 days or something like that on this thing, 4 3-hour days. But nevertheless, the muscles, any part of the anatomy could not have been done without my knowledge of values and my knowledge of gesture, of proportion and angle, and all these things that relate to the purely visual world, that are the stuff of the visual world. Monet there is just a terrific example of the color portion of it. The right color, the right value, the right place. And the music of this thing, never mind what it is, right? If you can't do this, your mastery of the visual world is weak, no matter what your knowledge of anatomy is. And by the way, I'm saying that this was done not from anatomy. I'd never resorted for a second to any anatomical ideas. And you may say, well, it looks like it, right? Sure, it looks like it. No, what I did do is I became rather a scientist about how this edge and this value relate to some other edge and some other values in other places on this thing. And so it's the collating of these things. And this is what they call the art of seeing, or the learning to see, right? Again, I recommend you read Gamble on the subject. He really makes the most profound statement. And it's not him alone by any means. Learning to see is learning to see the relationships of what? Of colors, of values, of chromas, of locations, of sizes, et cetera, right? But that's the visual world out of which you then make muscles, right? So you can't even get to this thing if you can't do that. This is exactly where I was left when I was working with Robert Beverly Hale. I just said, this doesn't even make sense. I can't draw. And Hale would come around and say, oh, I see you've been drawing for years. Well, you can see all sorts of things if you want to, but the point is, I didn't have the mastery of drawing. I didn't even know the names of things. I don't even know at that time if I understood the word values. I don't want to think about that, So I'll leave you with one last thought, and then there are maybe 2 points. And one is that, remember I was talking about architecture. I mean about perspective. Here's a watercolor by Sargent. And you can argue that the perspective looks to be pretty right, but should he have studied architecture? Would he have had to study architecture to draw this building right? And do you think he did? I mean, by the way, I'm not going to say he wasn't. He was a well-educated, homeschooled kid, right? And more. But if you say that you have to be educated in architecture to draw a facade like this, then you'd be wrong. And if you are wrong about this, then you'd be wrong about anatomy as well. So this is a challenge to everybody who's watching, and I say it to you with thoughtfulness and Antiguos. Let me know how to pronounce your name if that's wrong. I like it. It's a good name, cool name. But so then again, and here, now where's the anatomy going to help you, right? This is the science of effects, right? Look at the angle and the light effect here. Look at the size of that unit and compare it with this one, and notice the angle between these two, and the relationship between this one, which is even more intense light. That's our game. What's the darkest dark? What's the lightest light? Do you know the science of playing with these things? And do you know best methods for that? So if you like, I'll pick up next week and talk about all this stuff here. Because All painted imagery, from figure to landscape to still life, is made of values, value relationships, value transitions, color, color values, color saturation, color hues, color relations, angles, complex angles called gesture, long angles, intermittent angles, angle relationships, linear proportion, two-dimensional mass proportion, conceptualization of all these things, everything I'm saying here. You have to be skilled at conceptualization. You have to be able to make light effects and compare light effects, of value contrast, of edge and edge relationships, of form, and all the ways of its playing. The roundness, form shifts, flatness is one of the forms, of shape, arcs, complex arcs, points, paint handling, and all the ramifications to be able to execute this stuff. And what are the best methods for maximizing successful execution when you're drawing your figure with the muscles? So I would ask you to think through, for everybody who's thinking about this stuff, you may have already presumed that this is in the very nature of things. Of course you have to do this. But my suggestion to you is think this through, and I'll talk about these things next week if you like. I talk about them all the time in all my videos. So what will knowledge of anatomy get you if you lack knowledge of the essential content of the eye and the canvas? I say the eye and the canvas. Well, that's values, light and dark, things like that. That's the stuff you can put on a canvas and is related to the stuff you draw from the eye. So if you lack knowledge of the essential content of the eye and the nature of the content of a canvas, which is just darker and lighter in color, and then size, relations, placements. But what can you do if you haven't developed the methods and skills to execute this stuff with? How will the knowledge of anatomy help? So that's my challenging question, and I'll try to give you some more feedback about it next week if you'd like. All right. Thank you, Antiguos. All right. See you next time, folks.